And so it was during that first year, during that seasoning period, that people still had hope. They still believed that maybe somehow they could get back to their family, back to their loved ones. And because of that, it was during this seasoning period when masters were dealing with, well, they sometimes called them seasoning slaves, or other times they called them saltwater slaves, because they had just come in off the ocean, right? Well, it was during that period, during this first year, when rebellion was most likely to be attempted. Very, very unlikely to be successful, but quite likely to be attempted. And it was also during this first year, this seasoning year, when people were most likely to try to run away. And of course, very, very likely to just be recaptured because they had no idea where they were running to. By the end of the year, as we talked about, enslaved people had learned enough English to be able to function, and their focus shifted, for the most part, from how do I escape to the much more practical and pertinent question, how do I survive? So, the seasoning period was the period of greatest adaptation, greatest adjustment. Now, on the next slide here, you'll see two numbers for each colony. And you see that one number is listed in blue, and then another number listed in red, right? So for each colony, a number in blue, a number in red. The blue number is the number of black people in that colony in 1680. All right, so blue is 1680. And then the red is 1740. And so pick any colony and tell me what happened between 1680 and 1740. It goes up everywhere, every single place. And in some places, of course, it is dramatic. Virginia from 3,000 to 60,000. Maryland from 1,500 to 24,000. South Carolina, which remember was just established right around 1680, 200 to 30,000. And in the graph over here, you see the total enslaved or African American population. And of course, almost all of those African American people are enslaved people. So, although the number goes up in every single colony, you can also tell that it really is different in one region of the colonies, the northern ones, as opposed to the southern ones. Look from Maryland on down at how big those numbers are in 1740. And you may be looking at Georgia with its small number, but remember the way the timeline works out, Georgia doesn't actually legalize slavery until the 1750s. So, all right. Okay, but look up then above Maryland, and what colony has the greatest number of slaves? Well, that is New York with 9,000. New Jersey with about 4,000. So historians often talk about two different types of colonies here in America. The colonies from Maryland, rather the colonies above Maryland, so Pennsylvania, and yes, we would include the joke that is Delaware in this. From Pennsylvania on up, those could usefully be called societies with slaves. And what that means is that slavery exists in all those colonies. Slavery is legal there. But the colonies are not built around slavery in the North. Slavery exists, but it's not central. From Maryland on down, the 5 southern colonies that we've talked about, well, those are slave societies. And note the important difference in the language, right? Slave societies. And what that means is that they were completely dependent on slavery. If slavery were to suddenly disappear, those societies in the South would collapse from their present form. If slaves disappeared in the North, well, in a lot of places, people would be like, hey, what happened to that guy? Because slavery was relatively rare, all right? Okay, so one more time. In the North, societies with slaves, and in the South, slave societies. And as you all know, because you would write it on a test, right? There are 5 southern colonies, and that means 5 different governments. Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. But there are 5 different governments, 5 different colonies, but we could also conceptualize it as really there are 2 slave societies in the South. And what make them 2 distinctive slave societies is the crop, because the crop then shapes the nature of the society. So this slave society, and I'll try to draw it with my finger, all right? It would sort of go like that. That slave society is the tobacco slave society. And so that would include Maryland, much of Virginia, and part of North Carolina. And then the other slave society would look like this. All right, and that is the rice slave society, which would include the coasts of Georgia, South Carolina, and a bit of North Carolina. So where we're headed now then is to compare tobacco slavery and rice slavery, the 2 forms of slavery most prominent here in colonial America. And we'll start with tobacco slavery in the Chesapeake region. Here in the Chesapeake, the first central point about tobacco slavery is that you didn't need a lot of workers to grow tobacco. You could, if you were hardworking, well, you could grow tobacco on a little piece of land by yourself. You might need to use somebody else's facilities to hang it and dry it and pack it, but you could grow it by yourself. Tobacco was sometimes called a poor man's crop because it could be done with a small number of hands. But if you wanted to get rich growing tobacco, of course you wanted to have more land and more workers under your control. But it was not essential to the cultivation of tobacco. So if I put it first really simply, think of it like this. In tobacco slavery, most people who owned slaves only owned a few. All right? It's a good way for me when I first started putting it in my head. Most people who owned slaves only owned a few. Now, of course, then there were some people who owned lots of slaves, but there weren't very many of those people. Most people who owned slaves only owned a few. So then if we take that vague but quite true statement and make it a little more concrete, a little more specific, well, there you go. If we think of that experience from the perspective of the enslaved people, well, then the way the numbers work out, 2/3 of the slaves lived with less than 20 other slaves. 2/3 of the slaves lived with less than 20 other slaves on the plantation where they lived. So then, sometimes I think it's easier to understand if it's more vague. So if I make that more vague, then it would go something like this. For most slaves in tobacco slavery, they only lived with a few other slaves. Okay. Because the work on a tobacco plantation was not particularly strenuous or deadly, Masters here in the Chesapeake, in tobacco slavery, well, they made a decision early in the colonial period that would turn out to be critical for the way this society developed. Masters decided that they could use African women to do the same tobacco field labor as African men. And that decision, that basically we can make an African woman do most of the same work as a man, well, that decision meant that the sex ratio here in the tobacco slavery region, the sex ratios among the enslaved evened out. You began to get roughly equal numbers of men and women. And that meant that enslaved people started to reproduce the enslaved population naturally. This was the first place in the New World where the enslaved population actually started to grow through reproduction. Think about what you already know. In the Caribbean, what's the only way the slave population grows bigger? Exactly. Right, Karen. It's that they're really bringing slaves in faster than they kill them off. So, here in the Chesapeake, enslaved people never became the majority of the population. In the graph down here, the blue line is the white population, and the red line is the black population, the green line, the Indian population. So blue is the white people, the red line is black people. And you can see that while the population number of the enslaved starts shooting upward, it does not ever cross the blue line. So slaves never become the majority of the population. Because families started to occur among the enslaved, masters realized it was to their benefit to let enslaved people live together as families. First, of course, they would own the next generation of the enslaved, because slavery is hereditary through the mother. But in some ways, even more importantly, masters realized that if their enslaved people / property had families, they were a little less likely to run away, a little less likely to try to rebel. So, for the enslaved, well, this made being enslaved a little less awful. But that actually worked to the master's benefit, because it bound people more tightly to their condition. And we'll see this as we go forward with lots of other aspects of enslaved people's experience. But where we're headed next is to the system of labor that developed in tobacco slavery. Oh, but before we get there, I should say one more thing. And that is that because most enslaved people here only lived with a few other enslaved people, compared to, say, the Caribbean, or compared to what we'll see down in rice slavery, well, here, in the tobacco slavery, enslaved people adopted English culture faster. Now, again, that only makes sense if you compare it to something else, and that is faster than what we'll see in rice slavery, or definitely faster than in the Caribbean, where you'll remember, through the Caribbean, slaves are like what percentage of the population? Exactly, good Sam, like 90%. Okay, so going forward from here, we'll move on to gang labor, the system of organizing work in tobacco slavery.